In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and ships, and one man whose entire universe is a single one of them. 5 kilometers of iron, 5,000 years old, where the first sound he ever heard was the hull singing with impacts. His mother said that as a newborn, he didn't cry. He just turned his head toward the metal and listened to the ship fighting, the way another child turns toward its mother's voice. She said it scared her. Not the battle, him. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from a man called Breck, born in the deeps of the battleship Valahest, the bilge parishes, the lowest habitable decks, where the gravity is thickest and the people are what the scribes politely call ship stock, hereditary crew, bonded labor, words that mean slave but let the clerks sleep at night. As a boy, he was a char-scraper, crawling on his belly through exhaust ducts too narrow for anyone with shoulders, in the dark, scraping carbon from walls hot enough to blister skin. He was born on the Valahest. He will die on the Valahest. And in between he lived the only life a man like him was ever going to get. Not a hero's, not a villain's, just the kind that happens in the guts of a warship when nobody is writing it down. He learned too late what the silence beyond the metal was, the same silence his mother used to stare at. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The first thing I ever heard was the ship screaming. Not that I knew what it was. I was a few minutes old, wet and red and choking on recycled air in a hammock slung between 2 coolant pipes on deck 93. But the Valahest was taking fire that day, some orc raider getting too close to the flotilla's flank, and the hull was singing with impacts. My mother told me later that the whole deck swayed like a pendulum, that the lights died for 6 full seconds, and that I did not cry, not once. She said I just listened, that I turned my head toward the metal and listened to the sound of the ship fighting, the way another child might turn toward its mother's voice. She said it scared her. Not the battle. Me. My name is Breck. I was born on the Valahest, and I will die on the Valahest, and in between those two events I have lived the only life a man like me was ever going to live. Not a hero's life, not a villain's, just the kind of life that happens in the guts of an Imperial Warship when no one is writing it down, which is to say a life that is both unbearably long and terrifyingly short, depending on where you are standing when the bulkheads seal. Let me tell you what I know, because no one else will. The Valahest is old. When I say old, I do not mean the way people on groundside worlds use the word, where old means a few centuries, a ruin, a stretch of collapsed road that someone once walked. I mean old in the way the Imperium measures it. 5,000 years at a minimum, according to the engravings on the primary keel, possibly older. The tech priests won't confirm it. They worship the ship the way a man might worship his own beating heart, with reverence and terror in equal measure, and no desire whatsoever to know the exact date it started. The Valahest is an apocalypse-class battleship, nearly 5 kilometers from prow to stern, though I never measured it myself. You don't measure the thing you live inside. You feel it. The length of a corridor you have walked 10,000 times. The distance between the sound of the morning tolls and the place where the echo dies. The amount of time it takes for a scream to travel from deck 93 to the ears of someone on deck 40 who might care, which is exactly long enough for the screaming to stop. Deck 93 is where I come from. The deeps, the bilge parishes, The belly of the ship where the gravity is thickest, because the grav plates down there haven't been properly calibrated since before my grandmother's grandmother was pulling her first breaths through the same stale air I pulled mine. You could feel the extra weight in your knees after a while, a kind of grinding ache that never fully went away, like the ship was pressing down on you, reminding you of your place, which is exactly what it was doing in its way. The deeps were the lowest habitable decks, crammed between the plasma reactor housings and the ventral hull plating, and the people who lived there, my people, were the lowest thing aboard that could still be called human. Not slaves, not technically. The Imperium doesn't call them slaves. Bonded labor, hereditary crew, ship stock, words that mean the same thing but let the scribes sleep at night. My mother was a woman named Metha, and she had hands like knotted rope, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same gray iron as the walls around her. She was beautiful. I know that sounds wrong, but beauty in the deeps doesn't mean what it means in the bright decks where the officers live. Down where we were, beauty meant strength. It meant someone who could stand a full 18-hour shift sorting carbon and still have enough left in her to hold her child. Metha had that. She had wide shoulders and a jaw like a gun mantlet, and when she laughed, which was not often but not never, the sound rattled in her chest like a bolt round in a magazine. She was a munitions porter carrying shells from the deep magazines to the loading hoists that fed the gun decks above. She had been doing it since she was 12. She would do it until the day she died. That is not a metaphor. On the Valahest, your job was your blood. Your mother's job became your job unless something happened to change the current, and very little ever did. But I did not carry shells. I was too small for that when I was young, and by the time I was big enough, something else had claimed me. I was a char-scraper. That was my trade, my birthright, my inheritance from no one in particular, since my mother's work was munitions, and I had no father anyone would name. A char-scraper crawls through the exhaust systems of the ship, the secondary venting ducts that carry waste heat and combustion residue away from the engineerium and the reactor housings, and scrapes the carbon buildup from the walls. The carbon accumulates in thick crusts over time, black, dense, sharp enough to cut skin if you handle it wrong. If it builds up too much, the ducts narrow, the airflow chokes, and eventually the pressure differentials can blow a seal somewhere that matters. So every cycle, children were sent in. Always children. The ducts were too narrow for anyone with shoulders wider than a handspan. You crawled on your belly through passages that were hot enough to blister bare skin. In the dark, breathing air that tasted like burnt metal and old grease, scraping the walls with a flat blade that was the only tool you were given. You filled a sack. When the sack was full, you dragged it behind you, back out through the same passage, and you dumped the carbon at the collection point where it was compressed into fuel blocks for the secondary generators. Then you went back in. That was my world for the first 11 years of my life. I crawled through the ship's veins. I breathed what the ship breathed out. The carbon stained my hands and my face, and eventually my lungs, and it never fully washed off no matter how much water you used, which was not much, because water in the deeps was rationed to 4 cups a day, and you learned to drink 3 and save 1 for your face, so the overseers could see your eyes when they checked if you were still alive. Every char-scraper I knew had the same look, a kind of permanent shadow under the skin, gray-black, like we were being slowly absorbed into the ship itself, like the Valahest was eating us 1 layer at a time. People died in the ducts. I want to be clear about that because it matters. They died from heat, from suffocation, from collapses when a section buckled, from gas pockets that no one had charted. I knew a girl called Yive who went into a lateral vent on deck 88 and never came back. They didn't send anyone to look for her. The next shift, they sent another child into the same duct, and that child came back with a full sack and said nothing about what she might have crawled over on the way. That is how things worked. You didn't mourn in the deeps. You noted the absence and you went on, because there was always more carbon and always more ducts, and the ship didn't stop needing you just because you were sad. I was good at it. I say that not to boast, but to explain what happened next, because being good at something in the deeps is a double-edged thing. It means you survive. It also means people notice you, and being noticed in the belly of a warship is not always the gift it sounds like. I was fast. I was small, even for a char-scraper, and I had a way of reading the ducts. The temperature changes, the air pressure shifts, the way the metal groaned when a pocket was forming. That kept me ahead of the dangers that killed other children. I could fill my sack in 2/3 the time it took the next fastest scraper, and I did it without losing fingers or getting trapped. The overseers marked me. They gave me extra water. They gave me the longer routes, the ones that went deeper into the ship's core, where the heat was worse and the carbon was thicker, and the air was the kind of thin that made you see lights behind your eyes if you worked too long without backing out. I did those routes because I was told to, and because the extra water meant I could give a cup to my mother, and because saying no to an overseer in the deeps meant the correction detail, and the correction detail meant things I don't need to describe, because you either know or you don't. My mother hated that I scraped char. She never said it directly because direct speech about unhappiness was not something the deep-born practiced. It was too dangerous. If you said out loud that your life was unbearable, someone from the tithe clerks might overhear, and then you had a conversation with the discipline master, and then you understood that unbearable was a relative term, and your previous situation had actually been quite tolerable by comparison. So Matha didn't say she hated it. What she did was touch my hands when I came back from a shift, turning them over, running her thumbs over the cuts and the calluses and the carbon ground into the creases of my palms, and she would make a sound, a small sound, not quite a sigh, not quite a word, just a vibration in her throat. And then she would hand me my water ration and go back to her hammock and stare at the ceiling, which was actually the underside of Deck 92's floor plating, and she would stare at it for a long time without moving. That sound she made, I still hear it. After everything that has happened, after all the things I've seen and done and survived and failed to prevent, it is my mother's sound that stays. A small, defeated noise in the throat of a woman who never once called herself defeated. The Valahest carried somewhere around 80,000 souls, depending on who was counting and whether they bothered to count the deep-born, which they usually didn't. The official crew manifests, I learned much later, listed about 55,000. The rest of us were surplus, unlisted, uncounted, unnoticed, until someone needed another body for a work gang or a conscription tithe, or a void burial detail. We existed in the margins of the ship the way vermin exist in the margins of a hab block. Tolerated because removing us would cost more than ignoring us, and occasionally useful in ways that no one wanted to examine too closely. The deep-born were the Valahest's secret organ, its hidden stomach, and we processed everything the upper decks didn't want to think about. The dead were rendered down on Deck 90 for tallow and bone paste. The waste was cycled through the reclamation systems that the deep-born maintained with their bare hands because the tech priests wouldn't send servitors that far down. The carbon was scraped. The bilge water was filtered. The 1,000 small, necessary things that kept an ancient warship breathing were done by people whose names were not recorded anywhere. And if the ship had lungs, we were the cilia inside them, tiny and countless and absolutely essential and absolutely expendable. There were children everywhere in the deeps. That is something the holopics and the recruitment scrolls never show you. The sheer number of children on an Imperial warship. We ran in packs through the corridors, feral and quick and loud, and the adults let us because there was nowhere to go and nothing to get into that was worse than what we already lived in. I had my pack. We ran the stretch between Deck 93 and the sub-bilge access ways near the keel, a territory we held through the simple authority of knowing every duct, every hidden crawl space, every place where the grav plate stuttered, and you could float for half a second if you jumped at the right moment. That half second of weightlessness was the closest thing to joy I knew as a child. The feeling of the ship letting go of you, just for a heartbeat, before it pulled you back down. We stole. Of course we stole. Food, mostly, from the tithe carts that came through the deeps, distributing the rations. Starch blocks and protein paste and the gray, faintly sweet water that the recyclers produced. Stealing was punished by the removal of a finger, one per offense, administered by the deck overseers with a bolt cutter and no anesthetic. And I knew children who had 3 fingers left and still stole, because hunger is a louder voice than fear. I was careful. I stole enough to survive the days when the rations were cut, which happened whenever the ship entered a combat zone and the supply priorities shifted upward to the fighting decks. And I was never caught, not once. I was quick and I was quiet, and I understood the rhythms of the overseers the way I understood the rhythms of the ducts, as patterns that could be read and exploited if you paid attention. There is something I should say about the sound of the ship, because it matters to everything that follows. The Valahest was never silent. Never. Not once in my entire life. The ship spoke in a language of vibrations and hums and groans that was as constant as breathing and as varied as weather. The plasma reactors produced a low, subaudible thrum that you felt in your teeth more than you heard with your ears. The grav plates added a layered harmonic on top of that, a kind of singing note that changed pitch depending on which deck you were on and how well the plates were functioning. The air recyclers wheezed. The coolant systems ticked. The hull flexed and popped with thermal expansion when the ship adjusted its heading relative to a star, and each pop was a different note in a chord that only the deep-born knew how to read. I grew up inside that sound. It was my weather, my calendar, my warning system. When the reactor thrum dropped by half a tone, it meant the enginarium was throttling back, which meant the ship was preparing for a course change or a warp translation. When the grav plates whined, it meant power was being diverted, probably to the void shields, which meant combat was imminent. When the hull groaned in a specific low frequency that I can still feel in my chest if I close my eyes, it meant the Valahest was hurting, and you needed to find something solid to hold on to because the next few minutes were going to be very bad. I never learned to read words until much later, but I could read the ship from birth. Every deep-born child could. We navigated by sound and vibration the way a void sailor navigates by stars. Our charts were in our bones, and when I tell you that the Valahest was alive, not in the metaphorical sense that the officers used when they spoke of the machine spirit in their formal rituals, but alive in the way that a body is alive, with breath and pulse and moods and sicknesses. I am not being poetic. I am telling you what I know. The ship breathed, the ship ached. The ship, in its own vast and incomprehensible way, knew we were there. I believe that. I have always believed that. It is the closest thing I have to faith. My mother died when I was 11. I will tell you how, because you need to understand the shape of it. She did not die in battle. She did not die from a disease or an accident or any of the 1,000 mundane ways that people die in the deeps. She died because someone decided she should, and that decision was made for reasons that were logical and defensible and utterly without mercy, the way all Imperial decisions are. There was a hull breach. That much is true, and that much I remember. The Valahest was engaged in a running fight with an Eldar corsair that had been harrying the fleet for weeks, and during one of the exchanges, a lance strike burned through the port ventral armor and opened Deck 90 to the void. The breach was contained, sealed off by the emergency bulkheads that slammed shut with a sound like the voice of the Emperor himself, but the damage to the surrounding decks was severe. The structural integrity of the entire portside lower section was compromised. Decks 88 through 94 were showing stress fractures, atmospheric loss, micro breaches that the damage control teams couldn't find fast enough. Somewhere above us, in the bright world of the command bridge, someone was looking at a schematic of the ship and making calculations. How many decks could be sacrificed to save the rest? How many souls could be written off against the cost of structural failure? It is the kind of arithmetic the Imperial Navy practices the way a priest practices prayer, constantly, rigorously, and without any expectation that it will feel good. The order came down to vent decks 91 through 94. Full atmospheric purge, blow the seals, cycle the air out, let the void rush in and freeze the structural damage in place before it could spread. It would kill the micro breaches. It would stabilize the hull. It would save the Valahest. It would kill everyone on those 4 decks who couldn't make it to the sealed sections in time. The warning came as a klaxon, a rising, falling wail that meant nothing to most of the deep-born because we had never been trained in the emergency signals. Those were for the proper crew, the listed names, the people who mattered. We heard the klaxon, and some of us ran toward it, and some of us ran away from it, and some of us stood still because we didn't know what it meant. And then the seals opened and the air began to leave. I was in a duct. Deck 89, lateral exhaust vent, secondary grid. I was halfway through a scraping run when I heard the klaxon and felt the pressure drop. A sudden, violent thinning of the air that popped my ears and pulled at my lungs like a hand reaching inside my chest. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was wrong, and I did what any char-scraper does when the duct goes wrong. I backed out as fast as I could, dragging my sack behind me, and I came out into a corridor that was full of people running and a sound I had never heard before, which was the sound of the ship opening itself to the void. A deep, hollow roar, like the Valahest, was exhaling, like it was letting something go. I made it to a sealed section. I was small and fast, and the Emperor, or the ship, or dumb luck, decided that I would live. I crossed a bulkhead line 17 seconds before the seal came down, and I know that number because a crewman on the other side told me later. 17 seconds. That was the gap between my life and my death, and it was not determination or courage or anything noble that carried me across it. It was the fact that I had been in a duct on 89 instead of on 93 where I was supposed to be, because I had taken someone else's route that shift in exchange for a half ration of protein paste. My mother was on deck 93. She was carrying shells because that is what she did, and when the klaxon sounded, she would have tried to reach the nearest bulkhead seal. I know this because I know my mother, and she was not a woman who stood still. She would have run. She would have run with those knotted rope hands and that iron jaw, and she would have been fast because Matha was always fast when it counted. But Deck 93 was deep in the vent zone, and the distance between the munitions corridor and the nearest sealed section was 400 meters, and the seals closed in 90 seconds from the klaxon, and 400 meters in 90 seconds is a pace that only a trained armsman can maintain. And my mother was not a trained armsman. She was a munitions porter with bad knees and a 12-hour shift behind her. They told me she made it to within 60 meters of the seal. Someone saw her. Someone on the other side of the bulkhead, looking through the viewport as the seal came down, saw a woman running in a corridor where the air was already thinning, where the frost was already forming on the walls, and they saw her fall. Not dramatically. She didn't throw her hands up or cry out or do any of the things that people do in stories. She just fell. Her body went limp and she dropped to the deck like someone had cut her strings, and then the seal closed and that was the end of it. 2,306 people died in the venting. My mother was one of them. I was not. I did not find out for 3 days. The sealed sections were locked down while damage control worked, and the surviving deep-born were packed into spaces never meant to hold that many bodies. We sat in the dark because the lumen cells on that stretch of Deck 88 had failed, and we breathed air that got thinner and hotter with every hour, and no one came to tell us anything because we were not listed crew and therefore not anyone's responsibility to inform. On the 3rd day, the seals opened, and we were herded back to the habitable sections of the deeps, and I went to Deck 93 and found it empty. Not damaged. Empty. The air was back. The ship's recyclers had repressurized the vented decks within hours. The frost had melted. The lights worked. Everything was exactly as it had been, except that everyone who had lived there was gone. Their hammocks were still slung. Their meager possessions, tools, blankets, the small devotional icons that the deep-born carved from waste metal and prayed to when the ship entered the warp, were still in place. It was like walking into a tomb that didn't know it was a tomb yet. I found my mother's hammock. Her water cup was still on the hook beside it, half full. I drank it. Then I sat on her hammock and I waited, though I could not have told you what I was waiting for, and when no one came and nothing changed and the ship's thrum continued its low, indifferent song, I got up and went back to work. I had ducks to scrape. The carbon did not care that my mother was dead. There were no funerals in the deeps. The dead from the venting were collected by the reclamation teams and processed in the usual way. Bone paste for the hydroponics, rendered fat for machine lubricant, usable tissue for the protein vats. That was what happened to everyone who died on the Valahest. Your body belonged to the ship, the same as your labor and your loyalty and your children. You were born from the ship's resources, and you were returned to them when you were done. A cycle, clean and terrible and completely without sentiment. After the venting, I was reassigned, not because anyone cared about my well-being, but because the deep deck population on the port side had been reduced by over 2,000, and the work rosters needed to be rebalanced. I was 12 by then, too big for the smallest ducks, though still small enough for the secondary routes, and someone somewhere decided I was more useful as a runner. A message carrier. The Valahest's internal communication systems were old and unreliable, especially in the deeps where the cabling hadn't been replaced in centuries. For anything urgent, they used runners, children and young adults who knew the ship's layout well enough to navigate the maze of corridors, ladderways, and access shafts that connected the lower decks. You carried message cylinders from one station to another, and you carried them fast, because the contents were usually orders that someone needed immediately. If you were late, you were punished. If you lost the cylinder, you were punished worse. If you read it, assuming you could read, which most deep-born couldn't, you disappeared, and no one asked where you went. I ran messages for 2 years. It was better than scraping char. The air was cleaner, the work was lighter, and I covered more of the ship in those 2 years than most deep-born see in a lifetime. I learned the mid-decks, the transitional zones between the deeps and the crew quarters where the gravity was lighter and the corridors were wider and the people walked differently, straighter with their heads up, like they had somewhere to be that mattered. I saw ratings in their off-duty hours, playing cards and drinking rotgut, and laughing about things I didn't understand. I saw the armory decks where the armsmen trained, running drills with loss guns and cutlasses under the shouts of drill sergeants who seemed to exist in a permanent state of fury. I saw the edges of the gun decks, vast, echoing cathedrals of metal where the macro-cannon batteries waited in their housings like sleeping beasts, each one the length of a habitation block, each one crewed by dozens of men and women who lived and slept and ate in the shadow of a weapon that could level a city with a single shot. The Valahest was not one place. It was 1,000 places stacked on top of each other, and I was starting to see the shape of all of them. And that is when they came for me. The conscription tithe, which is the polite name for what happens when the gun decks need fresh bodies, and the deeps have surplus young men who are fast and strong, and have no one important enough to object to their removal. A tithe clerk appeared at my runner station on a nothing special morning, a thin woman with augmetic eyes and a data slate that she consulted the way a priest consults a scripture, and she read my designation number, which was the only name the Valahest's bureaucracy had ever given me, and she told me I was to report to Gun Deck 7, Port Battery, Macro Cannon Emplacement 41, by the end of the current watch. She did not ask if I wanted to go. She did not explain what would happen when I got there. She checked a box on her slate and walked away to find the next name on her list. And that was the end of my life as a runner and the beginning of everything else. I was 14 years old. I had been alive on the Valahest for 14 years, and I had never once fired a weapon, seen the void through anything but a third-hand description, or spoken to anyone who held a rank above deck overseer. I owned nothing except the clothes I wore, which were ship-issue rags that had been recycled so many times the fabric had no color left, and the flat-scraping blade I had carried since I was 7, which I kept tucked in my belt because it was the only thing in my life that had been mine and mine alone. I took it with me to the gun deck. I still have it. Gun Deck 7 was a world I was not prepared for. I had seen the edges of it during my time as a runner. The distant shapes of the cannon housings, the echoing space, the faint smell of propellant and machine oil that drifted down the corridors like a perfume. But stepping onto the deck itself was something else entirely. The scale of it broke something in my mind. I had spent my entire life in the deeps, in corridors you could touch both walls of with outstretched arms, in ducts where the ceiling pressed against your back, in spaces that were measured in body lengths and defined by their closeness. Gun Deck 7 was open. The ceiling was 40 meters above me. The cannon housings stretched away in rows like the pillars of a cathedral I had seen carved on one of the devotional icons in the deeps. The space between them was wide enough to drive a cargo hauler through, and the air. Emperor. The air. It moved. There was a ventilation system on the gun deck that actually worked, and the air came through in currents that you could feel on your face, and it was cooler and cleaner than anything I had ever breathed in my life, and I stood there in the entranceway like an idiot with my mouth open, breathing, and the man who would change my life was watching me do it. His name was Ossid Vrant, Master Gunner, Port Battery, Macro Cannon Emplacement 41. He was the kind of man that the Imperial Navy produces in quantity, hard, competent, scarred in ways that were both visible and not, with a voice like a bulkhead being dragged across a metal floor. He was in his 50s when I met him, though he looked older, the way everyone on the Valahest looked older than they were, because the ship aged you the way vacuum ages metal, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. He had been born on the ship, same as me, but not in the deeps, mid-deck born, crew quarter stock, the son of a loader who was the son of a loader who was the son of a loader, going back 9 generations, which on the Valahest was as close to aristocracy as anyone below the officer class could claim. He had risen through the gun crews by being better at the work than anyone around him and meaner than anyone who tried to stop him. And by the time I arrived, he had been running Emplacement 41 for 20 years, and the cannon had the highest accuracy rating on the port side and the lowest casualty rate among its crew, and both of those things were because of him, and everyone knew it. He looked at me the way you look at something you've ordered from the stores and are disappointed to receive. I was short, thin, stained gray-black from the carbon. I had the look of the deeps all over me, the hunched shoulders and the flinching eyes, and the way I kept my back to the wall, because in the deeps you never stood in the open if you could help it. He walked around me in a slow circle, making a sound in his throat that was half assessment and half disgust. And then he said the first words he ever said to me, which were, "You'll do. You won't be good, but you'll do. Go find Tessic. Tell him you're the new sponge boy, and if you touch anything on the cannon before I tell you to, I'll have your hands." Tessic was the emplacement's second loader, a thick-necked man with a permanent squint and arms like mooring cables. He showed me my station, which was at the base of the cannon's breech mechanism, and he explained my job, which was to sponge the bore after each firing. When the cannon discharged, the residue left inside the barrel had to be swabbed out before the next shell could be loaded, and this was done by hand, with a long-handled mop that weighed as much as I did and had to be shoved into a tube that was still radiating enough heat to cook meat. The sponge boy went in first, before the loaders, before the rammers, before anyone. And if the bore hadn't cooled enough, or if there was a residual charge that the discharge hadn't cleared, the sponge boy was the one who found out. It was, in the hierarchy of the gun crew, the lowest and most dangerous position, which is why it was always filled by the newest conscript, which is why it was filled by me. I will not tell you that I loved it, because that would be a lie. The first time the cannon fired with me standing at the breech, I thought the ship had been hit by a torpedo. The sound was beyond sound. It was a physical force, a wall of pressure that slammed through your body and shook your organs and left a ringing in your ears that lasted for hours. The deck jumped. The cannon housing rocked back on its recoil rails with a shriek of metal that cut through even the deafness of the blast. Smoke and heat roared out of the breech like the breath of something alive and angry, and before the smoke had cleared, Tessic was shouting at me to get the sponge in. Get it in now. Move, move, move. And I was shoving that mop into a tube I couldn't see, my arms shaking, my ears bleeding, my mind a white blank of shock and terror. That was my first firing. We fired 14 more times in that engagement. By the 5th shot, I had stopped flinching. By the 10th, I had found a rhythm. By the 14th, I was faster than the sponge boy on emplacement 42, and Ossid Vrant, who had been watching from his station at the traverse controls, made that sound in his throat again. But this time it was different. Not disgust. Something else. I didn't have a word for it then. I do now. It was recognition. The gun crew became my family. Not in the warm, sentimental way that people use that word on planets where families are things you choose and treasure. In the hard, functional way that a gun crew is a family on a warship. A unit of people whose survival depends on each other's competence, bound together by shared danger and shared space, and the absolute certainty that if one of you fails, all of you die. There were 28 of us on emplacement 41, and over the next 3 years, I learned every one of their names and their habits and their weaknesses and their strengths. Tessic, who was steady and strong and never panicked, and who drank himself unconscious every rest period and woke up ready to work as if it had never happened. Mivra, the shell handler, a woman from the mid-decks who had a gift for mathematics and could calculate firing solutions in her head faster than the cogitator that was supposed to do it for us. Old Graytha, the loader chief who had been on the gun crew for 40 years and whose hands shook when he wasn't working and steadied to iron when he was. Kelat, the youngest after me, a runner-turned-conscript like myself who had a stammer when he spoke, but whose hands were the fastest on the loading chain. Ossid oversaw all of us. He was not kind. Kindness on a gun deck is a liability, because kind people hesitate, and hesitation gets people killed. He was fair, in the way that a machine is fair, consistent, predictable, without favoritism or malice. If you did your job, he left you alone. If you failed, he corrected you, and his corrections were measured in bruises and extra shifts, never in cruelty for its own sake. I learned over time that this made him unusual. The master gunners on other emplacements were often sadists, men and women who had been broken by the gun deck, and who broke others in turn because it was the only power they had. Osid was not broken. He was hard and cold and utterly without sentiment, but he was not broken, and the difference mattered more than I can say. He taught me. Not formally. The Imperial Navy does not have a schooling system for deep-born conscripts. But in the gaps between watches, in the quiet hours when the gun crew rested in their hammocks slung between the cannon housing and the magazine wall, Osid would sit with me and talk. He taught me about the ship, not the deep-level understanding I already had, the instinctive reading of sounds and vibrations, but the mechanical truth of it, how the plasma reactors fed power to the void shields and the weapon systems, how the warp drive folded space, how the Geller field kept the things in the Imperium from reaching through the hull and touching what was inside. He taught me to read, not well, not fluently, but enough to understand a duty roster, a damage report, a navigation plot. He taught me the Imperial Gothic prayers that the gun crews recited before an engagement, and he taught me why they mattered. Not for the Emperor, he said, but for the men and women who spoke them, because a prayer gives the mind something to hold on to when everything else is fire and noise and fear. I asked him once why he was teaching me these things, why he had chosen me, a deep-born char-scraper with no connections, no patron, no value to anyone above Deck 60. He looked at me for a long time with an expression I couldn't read, and then he said something I have thought about every day since. He said, "Because someone has to survive long enough to remember how the gun works after the rest of us are dead." I thought he was talking about the cannon. He was, but he was talking about something else too, and it took me years to understand what. The first real battle, the first one I was conscious enough to remember as more than a blur of noise and terror, came 8 months after my conscription. The Valahest had been operating as part of a battle group in the Thessaphon Reach, hunting down a minor Chaos warband that had been raiding the shipping lanes. We found them near a dead world called Vostrin's Grief, a burned-out mining colony with nothing left but orbital debris and a name that should have been a warning. There were 3 of them, 2 raiders and a light cruiser, all bearing the marks of chaos, hulls covered in that organic, wrong-looking growth that chaos ships develop over time, as if the warp was trying to build something new out of the metal and not quite succeeding. They were outmatched. The Valahest alone outgunned all 3 of them, and we had 2 escorts with us besides. It should have been clean. It was not clean. The light cruiser rammed us. Not a glancing blow, not a calculated boarding maneuver, but a full-speed impact into the port flank, driving its prow through our hull armor like a blade into flesh. The hit shook the entire ship. On the gun deck, the deck plates buckled and 3 emplacements were knocked off their mounts, and the men and women crewing them were crushed or thrown, or simply erased by the structural failure that followed. Emplacement 41 was 400 meters from the impact point, close enough that the shock wave threw me off my feet and slammed me into the cannon housing hard enough to crack 2 ribs. The lights failed. The air filled with dust and smoke and the screaming of metal under stress. And in the darkness, above the ringing in my ears, I heard a sound that no one on a warship ever wants to hear. The deep, rhythmic thudding of something hitting the hull from the inside. Boarding pods. The Chaos Raiders had launched assault craft into the breach the cruiser had opened, and now there were enemies inside the ship. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter, and it went both ways. The chaos boarders came through the breach in a tide of screaming, bleeding, wrong-shaped things. Men and women who had once been human, but had been changed by whatever they worshipped into something that ran on four limbs and had too many joints and mouths in places where mouths should not be. They poured into the gun deck and hit the first emplacements before anyone had recovered from the impact, and the sounds that came from that direction were the sounds that I still hear in the quiet moments before sleep. The wet sounds, the breaking sounds, the sounds that human throats make when the thing killing them is taking its time. Osid rallied us. He stood on the cannon mount and he did not shout. He never shouted, but his voice cut through the chaos like a blade through smoke, steady and cold and absolutely certain. He told us our positions. He told us to arm ourselves. He told the loaders to pull shells from the magazine and distribute them to the crew as improvised weapons, because the gun crew's personal armament was 3 LUS guns and 2 shotguns for 28 people, and that was not going to be enough. I picked up a shell casing, a spent macro cannon casing the length of my forearm, solid brass, heavy as sin, and I held it the way Osid had taught me to hold a tool, with my weight forward and my grip loose enough to swing. They came. I will not describe what they looked like up close, because the details are not the point, and speaking them aloud gives them a weight they do not deserve. They came and we fought them, and fighting is a generous word for what happened. Tasik died in the first rush, his throat torn out by something with fingers like needles. Old Graether went down swinging a loading chain, and he took 2 of them with him before they pulled him apart. Kelat, stammering Kelat with the fast hands, pushed me behind him when one of them came at us from the flank, and he took the blow that was meant for me, and his blood hit my face and I tasted copper, and I swung the shell casing into the thing that had killed him, and I felt it connect, and I felt bone break, and I hit it again and again until it stopped moving, and then I hit it some more because I couldn't stop. Osid was beside me then, his hand on my shoulder, pulling me back. "Enough," he said. "Save it." We held emplacement 41. The boarding action lasted 11 hours. By the time the armsmen reinforcements arrived from the upper decks, the gun deck had been turned into a charnel house. And of the 28 crew on my emplacement, 9 were still alive. 9 out of 28. Tasek was dead. Graethe was dead. Kalat was dead. Mivra survived, though she lost her left hand and never did mathematics in her head again, because whatever they had injected her with during the fighting left a fog in her mind that never fully cleared. I survived. Osid survived. And the Vala Heist survived because it always did, because the ship was tougher than anything the galaxy could throw at it, and it took its dead and its damage, and it absorbed them the way it absorbed everything else, into the structure, into the cycle, into the endless grinding continuation of its existence. I was 14 and I had killed something that used to be human. I was 14 and my friends were dead and my ribs were cracked, and I was sitting on the gun deck floor in a puddle of blood that wasn't mine, holding a shell casing that was dented from impact, and Osid Vrant was looking at me with that expression I couldn't read, the one that wasn't disgust, the one I later learned to call recognition. And he said, "You didn't run." And I said, "There was nowhere to run to." And he made that sound in his throat, the one that meant he was thinking, and he nodded once, and that was the end of my first battle and the beginning of whatever I became next. After Vostren's grief, things changed. Not in the large ways. The Valahest continued its patrol. The gun crews were replenished with new conscripts, the dead were rendered and recycled, and their hammocks were filled by other bodies. That cycle never changed. What changed was me. The battle had done something to the way the ship's hierarchy looked at me. A deep-born conscript who survives his first boarding action is either lucky or useful, and the Navy doesn't believe in luck. Osid put in a word for me with the battery officer, a lieutenant whose name I never learned, and whose face I never clearly saw, because officers on the gun deck existed at a distance, like weather. You felt their effects, but you didn't look directly at them. Whatever Osid said was enough. I was removed from the sponge boy rotation and promoted to assistant loader, which meant I was still doing hard, dangerous work, but I was doing it one step further from the breach, and the difference between that step and the one before it was the difference between probably dying in the next engagement and possibly surviving it. I will not bore you with the details of every battle, every engagement, every crawling year of service between my promotion and what came later. The Valahest fought. That was what it did. That was the only thing it had ever done or would ever do, and the rhythm of it became the rhythm of my life, the way the reactor thrum had been the rhythm of my childhood. Patrol, translation to a new sector, patrol again, contact, battle, damage, repair, rearm, patrol. The cycle turned, and the years fell away like carbon flakes from a scraping blade, and I grew into them the way a tree grows into the shape of the wind that bends it. Not because it chooses to, but because there is no other direction to grow. I learned the cannon, not just the mechanical operation of it, which was complex enough, the loading sequences, the targeting protocols, the recoil management, the bore maintenance, the 1,000 small adjustments that turned a raw discharge into an aimed shot, but the character of it. Every macro cannon, Osid taught me, was an individual. Not in the way a person is individual, but in the way a blade is individual, shaped by its history, its use, its flaws. Emplacement 41's cannon was a Mars pattern, 7 centuries old, with a bore that pulled slightly to port after sustained firing, and a traverse mechanism that stuck at 43 degrees unless you kicked the housing in a specific spot that only Osid and I knew. Learning that kick, the angle, the force, the timing, took me 2 years, and when I finally got it right, when the traverse slid smooth under my hands without the hesitation that had been there since before I was born, Osid looked at me the way a man looks at the sun coming up after a long night. Just for a moment. Then his face closed again, and he told me my loading speed was still too slow and I needed to work on it. Years passed. I became a loader, then a senior loader, then the shell handler when Mivra finally retired to the medici deck with her fog-filled mind and her missing hand, and a commendation that no one would ever read. I was 22. I had been on the gun crew for 8 years. I had survived 11 major engagements and more minor ones than I could remember. I had killed men and Xenos and things that were neither, and I had watched friends die with a regularity that should have broken me but instead just wore a groove in my mind, a channel for the grief to flow through without pooling. The ship kept moving. The ship kept fighting. And I kept doing what I had always done, which was the next thing that needed to be done, because stopping was not something anyone had ever taught me how to do. Osid was aging. The years that the ship took from all of us were taking more from him, and I could see it in the way he moved. Slower, more deliberate, with a stiffness in his left hip that he never acknowledged and I never mentioned. He was 60, which on the Valahest was old. Not ancient, not decrepit, but old in the way that mattered. Old enough that the next bad engagement might be the one his body couldn't recover from. He knew it. I knew it. We didn't talk about it because talking about it would have meant acknowledging that the cannon would need a new master gunner someday, and that someday was visible on the horizon, and neither of us was ready to look directly at it. What we did talk about in the quiet watches was the ship, its history, its systems, its secrets, and the Valahest had many. Osid had been on the gun deck for over 30 years, and in that time he had accumulated a knowledge of the ship that went beyond mechanics and into something close to understanding. He knew which decks had been sealed since before anyone alive could remember and what lay behind them. He knew the routes the tech priests used when they didn't want to be seen, the hidden corridors and maintenance shafts that connected the Engineerium to the bridge by paths that no ordinary crew member was supposed to know existed. He knew the names of the last 12 Lord Captains and the manner of each one's death, which was knowledge that should have been above his clearance and probably was. He told me about the ship's past engagements, not the sanitized versions that the Commissar's office distributed after each battle, but the real stories, the ones the gun crews passed down. He told me about the Battle of the Hespearn Gate, where the Valahest had held a choke point alone against a fleet of Chaos renegades for 9 days, and the gun decks had fired so continuously that the barrel of Emplacement 12 had actually melted and fused to its housing, and they had to cut it free with plasma torches while the engagement was still happening. He told me about the Corin expedition, where the ship had translated into a system that was supposed to be empty and found a space hulk the size of a moon, crawling with orcs, and the Valahest had spent 3 weeks systematically destroying it, section by section, until the hulk broke apart and the debris field stretched for 1,000,000 kilometers. He told me about the Harrowing, which was the name the crew gave to a warp transit gone wrong sometime in the ship's distant past, when the Geller field had flickered for 11 seconds and things had gotten inside, and it had taken 2 years to clear the ship, deck by deck, and there were still sections on the lower levels that no one went into because of what might still be waiting there. I listened. I learned. And the ship became something more than a machine to me. It became the only continuity I had, the only thing that outlasted everything else. I was 26 when I was promoted to gunnery mate, which is the rating below master gunner and the highest rank a non-commissioned crew member could hold on a single emplacement. The promotion came from OSID, recommended through the battery officer, and it carried with it privileges I had never imagined. A private berth instead of a shared hammock, an increased ration that included actual protein rather than paste, and access to the mid-deck common areas during rest periods, where I could walk among the crew quarter, Born, and the technical ratings and feel, for the first time, like I belonged to the same species as them. It also carried access. A gunnery mate had clearance to the battery's operational records, the maintenance logs, the damage reports, and the crew manifests going back decades. This was functional. I needed these records to do my job, to understand the cannon's history of faults and repairs, to track the supply chain for shells and propellant and replacement parts. But the records were stored in the battery archive, a small room behind the gun deck's main corridor that was stacked floor to ceiling with data slates and parchment rolls, and the records were not organized in any way that made sense, and finding what you needed meant searching through everything that was there. I spent 3 years in that archive, on and off, learning the cannon's history through its maintenance records, the way I had once learned the ship's moods through its sounds. 3 years of pulling slates, scanning, replacing. 3 years before my hand fell on the wrong one. I found what I was not looking for on a cycle that began like any other. I was searching for the maintenance log for Emplacement 41's recoil dampener, which had been showing signs of fatigue, and I needed to know when it had last been replaced. I was pulling data slates from the shelf, scanning them, putting them back, pulling more. In the mechanical way you do a tedious task when you have done it many times. And my hand fell on a slate that did not belong there at all, wedged behind a row of propellant requisitions in the deepest and least visited corner of the battery archive, its casing cracked and its label scratched out by hand. Not misplaced. Hidden. I picked it up and activated it, expecting a maintenance log or a supply requisition, and instead I found an operational order. It was dated 18 years prior. It was marked with the seal of the Lord Captain's office, which I had seen before on general orders, and engagement briefings. It was addressed to the Damage Control Authority of the portside lower decks, with copies to the battery commanders and the chief bosun. And it described, in the flat, affectless language of Imperial Navy bureaucracy, the planned emergency venting of decks 91 through 94. I read it. I read it 3 times because the first 2 times my mind could not hold what my eyes were seeing. The order was not a response to the hull breach. The order predated the hull breach by 6 hours. 6 hours! The venting that killed my mother, that killed 2,306 people, had been planned before the battle that supposedly caused it. The hull breach was real. The damage reports confirmed that. But the decision to vent had already been made. Someone had looked at the ship's structural assessments, calculated the risk of cumulative fatigue in the portside lower hull, determined that a controlled atmospheric purge was the most efficient way to address it, and signed the order before the first enemy lance had fired. The hull breach just gave them the cover to execute it. A convenient crisis. A justification that no one would question, because who questions a damage control decision made in the heat of battle? The order bore 2 signatures. The first was the Lord Captain's cipher, which could have been stamped by anyone in his office. The second was a countersignature from the Senior Gunnery Authority of the Port Battery, confirming that the gun deck's structural integrity was at risk and that the venting was necessary. The second signature was Osid Vrantas, and I understood then why the order had been buried in the battery archive instead of sealed away in command records where a document like that belonged. The counter-signatory keeps a copy of what he signs. That is procedure. That is how the Navy distributes responsibility so that no single hand can later claim clean. Osid had kept his copy. And instead of filing it or destroying it or letting it vanish into the ship's vast forgetting, the way 2,306 names had vanished, he had hidden it in the one archive that was his, in the deepest corner, behind the propellant requisitions, where no one but him would ever have reason to look. He had not been able to destroy it. He had carried it the way he carried everything, in silence, where no one could see the weight. I sat in that archive room for a long time. The data slate was in my hands, and inside my chest, something was breaking. Not my heart, something harder than that. Trust. The certainty that there was one person in this metal world who had taken me from the dark because he saw something in me worth saving. Osid had countersigned the order that killed my mother. And 3 years later, when the gun decks put in their tithe for fresh bodies, he had reached into the conscription rosters and pulled my designation onto his own emplacement, not at random, not because I was the strongest or the fastest, but because I was Metha's son. He had always known. Something in him, some part not yet fully armored against what he had done, had compelled him to find the child of the woman he had helped kill and keep that child where he could watch over it. Not love, not compassion, guilt. I should have hated him. Part of me did. The part that still belonged to Deck 93 and the half-full water cup. But the other parts, the gun deck, the cannon, 8 years of training, the man who taught me to read, those parts could not hate him. And the war between those 2 halves of me was the first war I ever lost. I confronted him, not in the archive, not in front of others. I waited until the rest watch when the gun crew was sleeping and the deck was quiet, except for the ship's breathing and the distant thrum of the reactors. And I went to his berth and I stood in the doorway and I held the data slate out in front of me and I said nothing. I just held it. And Osid looked at it and then he looked at me. And his face did something I had never seen it do before, which was nothing. It went completely still. No assessment, no disgust. No recognition, just a blankness like a bulkhead slamming shut. He said, "Sit down." I said, "You signed it." He said, "Sit down, Breck." I sat. And he told me the truth, or at least the version of the truth that he had been carrying for 18 years, and this is what it was. The port side lower hull had been failing. Not dramatically, not visibly, but in the slow, incremental way that things fail on a ship 5,000 years old. The structural assessments showed microfractures in the keel bracing between decks 88 and 95. The tech priests had flagged it. The Lord Captain's engineering staff had reviewed it. The consensus was that the section would hold under normal operations, but would fail catastrophically in any engagement that subjected the port side to sustained fire. A catastrophic failure at that point in the keel would break the ship in half. Not damage it. End it. 80,000 souls gone. The solution was a controlled purge. Vent the compromised decks, eliminate the atmospheric pressure that was contributing to the stress on the weakened structure, and allow the hull to be sealed and reinforced from the outside. The engineering staff estimated that the repair, once the section was voided, could be completed in 3 days. The loss of life would be significant but containable because the only people on those decks were deep-born, unlisted surplus, people whose absence would not affect the ship's fighting capability. Ossid did not defend it. He did not say it was right. What he said was, I was asked if the gun deck could survive without those 4 decks. I said yes. That is what they needed from me. That is what I gave them. He paused, and in that pause was a weight that I could feel, physical, pressing down. I did not give the order. I confirmed a technical assessment, but the result was the same, and I have known that every day since. I asked him why he took me. Why, out of all the children the venting had orphaned, he had reached for mine, and he told me how he knew. After the purge, as the officer who had put his name to it, he had been required to review the seal feeds, the picked records of the bulkheads closing, kept for the damage assessment. He had made himself watch them, and on one of them he had seen a woman in a munitions porter's rig get within 60 meters of a seal before the thinning air took her down. The last one out of that corridor, still running when she fell. He had traced her designation through the deep deck laborer rolls, and her dependence with it, and that was how he found me. Whoever she was, he said, she did not give up. I thought, if her child was anything like her, then maybe he deserved a chance I had no right to give him. But I gave it anyway because there was nothing else I could do. I sat with him for a long time after that. The ship hummed, the air cycled. Neither of us spoke. And when I finally got up and walked back to my berth, I took the data slate with me and I put it under my mattress, and I lay down and stared at the underside of the deck above me, the way my mother used to stare at the ceiling of deck 92. That is what I did. I bore it. I went back to the gun deck. I stood beside Ossid at the traverse controls, and I did my job and he did his, and we did not speak of it again. Not because it was resolved, not because I had forgiven him, but because the ship was still moving and the war was still happening and the cannon still needed to fire, and there was no room in the firing sequence for the weight of what I carried. The Valahest does not pause for grief. It does not pause for anything. It moves forward, always forward, and you move with it or you are left behind, and being left behind on a warship means being dead. What I did not expect was that the ship would force me to understand him. It happened 4 months after I found the data slate. An engagement in the Pellucid Straits against a Drukhari raiding party. Fast, vicious ships that darted in and out of lance range and bled us with precision strikes before vanishing back into whatever webway rift had spawned them. One of their hits punched through the hull 200 meters starboard of emplacement 41 and ruptured the secondary magazine access corridor, the corridor that ran directly beneath the gun deck and connected the deep deck munition stores to the loading hoists. The corridor was on fire. The autosuppressors had failed because of course they had, and the fire was moving toward the magazine. If it reached the shells, the entire port battery would cease to exist, along with half the ship's gun decks and everyone on them. The solution was immediate and obvious, and I saw it the instant the damage report came through on the gunnery Vox. Seal the corridor, drop the blast doors at both ends, and cut the fire off from both fuel and oxygen. It would burn itself out in minutes. The magazine would be safe. The gun deck would survive. There were people in the corridor. I could hear them through the floor plating. Deep-born munitions porters, the same job my mother had done, carrying shells through the same corridors she had walked, trapped between the fire behind them and the blast door ahead. There were 11 of them. I knew this because the corridor's internal picked feed was still active, and I could see them on the monitor at my station. A cluster of figures huddled at the northern blast door, pounding on it, their mouths open in shouts I couldn't hear over the klaxon and the roar of the cannon firing above them. 11 people, deep-born, unlisted, surplus. The mathematics were simple. 11 lives against 2,000 on the gun deck, against the entire port battery, against the ship. Osid was beside me. He looked at the monitor, and he looked at me, and he said nothing. His face was the same blank bulkhead it had been that night in his berth, and his hands were steady on the traverse controls, and he waited. He did not tell me what to do. He didn't have to. The fire was spreading. The temperature readings in the corridor were climbing. In 90 seconds, the fire would reach the magazine threshold, and the decision would stop being a decision and start being an explosion. I sealed the corridor. I reached for the damage control panel beside my station, and I entered the override code, and I dropped both blast doors, and I cut off 11 people from any chance of escape. I watched them on the monitor. I watched them turn from the sealed door and face the fire. I watched the smoke take them before the heat did, and I watched them fall, one after another, the way my mother had fallen, the way everyone falls when the ship decides they are the acceptable cost. The fire burned itself out. The magazine was saved. The port battery kept firing. The engagement was won. After the battle, when the deck was quiet, Osid came to me. He stood beside me the way I had stood in his doorway 4 months before, and he looked at me with an expression that was no longer unreadable. It was the expression of a man seeing himself in a mirror he hadn't wanted to look into. He said, "Now you know." And I did. I knew, not because I forgave him. Forgiveness was not a concept that had any application here, like trying to use a scraping blade to tune a cogitator. I knew because I had done the same thing. I had stood where he had stood, and I had made the same calculation, and I had come to the same answer. And the answer had been correct, and being correct had not made it weigh any less. I understood Osid Vrant the way you understand a wound, from the inside, where the bleeding is. Osid and I continued to work together. There was no alternative. The gun crew depended on us both, and removing either of us would have weakened the emplacement at a time when weakness got people killed. So we stood side by side at the cannon, cycle after cycle, engagement after engagement, and we functioned. The word matters. We did not reconcile. We did not heal. We functioned the way damaged machinery functions, getting the job done, but with a vibration in the mechanism that wasn't there before. A subtle wrongness that only someone who knew the machine intimately would detect. The new conscripts who replaced our dead came from the deeps, the same place I had come from. The work gangs, the orphan rolls, the endless supply of surplus human material that the ship consumed and replaced and consumed again. I trained them the way Osid had trained me, not with kindness but with consistency, and I watched some of them die the way I had watched Tessik and Graith and Kellet die, and I noted the absence and I went on. I was becoming the ship. Not metaphorically, literally. My skin had taken on the gray pallor of a man who has never seen sunlight. My hands were calloused into shapes that matched the tools I used. My hearing was damaged from years of cannon fire, a constant ringing in my left ear that the medici called void deafness and treated with a shrug and a stimulant injection that dulled the sound without eliminating it. I was the ship and the ship was me, and the boundary between us was getting thinner with every year that passed. Osid died at Carven. That was the name of the system. Carven, a nothing place with a dying star and 3 dead worlds, and an orc pirate fleet that had been using the debris fields as a staging ground. The engagement was routine by the Valahest's standards, a cleansing action, the kind of work the ship could do in its sleep and nearly did. The orc ships came at us in the usual way, all speed and aggression and no coordination, and the port battery opened fire and the cannon spoke, and the void lit up with the flashes of dying ships. Routine. Until it wasn't. The last orc vessel, a battered kill cruiser that should have been dead 3 salvos ago, managed to close to ramming distance before its engines finally died. It didn't ram us. It did something worse. It detonated. Whether the orcs did it deliberately or their reactor simply failed, the result was the same. A wall of force and shrapnel that hit the Valahest's port flank like a hammer hitting glass. The hull buckled. 3 sections of the gun deck ruptured simultaneously, and the void came in. I was thrown from my station. The gun deck was screaming, metal screaming, air screaming, men and women screaming. And in the smoke and the chaos, through the howl of atmosphere rushing toward the breaches, I saw the emergency bulkhead on the port side wall begin to descend. The automatic system was sealing off the damaged section to prevent the decompression from spreading. Standard procedure, the kind of system that saves ships. Except the bulkhead was jammed. Halfway down, grinding against the buckled deck plating, shrieking as the motors tried to force it through metal that had been bent out of alignment by the shockwave. The seal was incomplete, a gap of about a meter at the bottom, and through that gap the air was pouring out, and the temperature was dropping, and the pressure differential was pulling at everything on the deck. Tools, shell casings, debris people, dragging it all toward that gap like water circling a drain. The manual override was on the damaged side. The panel was mounted on the wall beside the bulkhead, 6 meters into the decompression zone, and to reach it you had to walk against the wind through air that was already thin enough to make your vision blur, toward a breach that was eating the ship's atmosphere with the patience of something that has been hungry for a very long time. Osid didn't say anything. He looked at me, and then he looked at the gap, and then he looked at the gun crew, 18 people pressed against the far wall, holding on to whatever they could reach, their faces masks of terror. And he did the arithmetic. The same arithmetic he had done on the day of the venting. The same arithmetic I had done in the magazine corridor. How many souls on one side? How many on the other? Which number is larger? Which number wins? He went through the gap. He crawled because the wind was too strong to walk, and he pulled himself along the deck plates hand over hand, using the bolt heads as grips, and the air was going and the cold was coming, and I could see him moving, getting smaller, getting further from us, getting closer to the panel. An old man, stiff hip, lungs that wheezed in the mornings. And he was crawling toward his own death with the steady, methodical pace of a man performing a maintenance task. He reached the panel. I saw his hand find the override lever. I saw him pull it. The bulkhead groaned and dropped the final meter, slamming into the deck with a sound like a cannon shot, and the gap sealed and the air stopped screaming and the gun deck was whole again. But Osid was on the wrong side, the decompressed side. The side where the void had already taken the air and the heat and anything that wasn't bolted to the structure. I went to the viewport set into the bulkhead. I looked through. He was on the deck, on his back, looking up. The frost was already forming on his face. His eyes were open. His mouth was moving, shaping words I couldn't hear through the metal and the vacuum. But I could read lips well enough, after half a lifetime of watching him speak across the noise of the gun deck. He said 4 words, the same 4 words he had said to me when he explained why he signed the venting order. "That is what I gave." Then his eyes went still and his mouth stopped moving, and the frost covered him, and Osid Vrant was dead. I stood at that viewport for a long time. The gun crew was behind me, alive because of what he had done. The deck was whole because of what he had given. And I thought about the 2,306 people who had died in the venting nearly 20 years ago, and I thought about the 11 porters I had sealed in the magazine corridor, and I thought about the mathematics of sacrifice, how the numbers always add up, how the equation always balances, and how the man doing the arithmetic always pays a price that doesn't show up in the calculation. Osid had been paying that price for nearly 20 years. Now the bill was settled. I was made Master Gunner of Emplacement 41 the following cycle. No ceremony, no speech. A notation on a data slate delivered by a tithe clerk with augmetic eyes who might have been the same woman who had conscripted me the better part of 2 decades earlier. Master Gunner Breck, Port Battery, Emplacement 41. A title, a responsibility, and a berth that still smelled like Osid's shaving soap when I moved into it. I scraped the soap residue off the shelf with my old char-scraping blade, and I put my few belongings in their place, and I got to work. But before I settled into the new routine, I did something I had not done in over 15 years. I went down. Back to the deeps. Back to Deck 93. A master gunner has clearance to move through most of the ship's non-restricted sections, and the deeps, whatever else they were not restricted. No one restricted access to a place that no one wanted to go. I went alone during the rest watch, down through the ladderways and access shafts I had once run as a message carrier, through the transitional zones where the corridors narrowed and the ceiling dropped and the gravity thickened. The mid-decks gave way to the lower decks, and the lower decks gave way to the deeps, and with each level the air changed, heavier, warmer, tasting of reclamation chemicals and old metal, and the faint organic undertone of too many bodies in too little space. I barely recognized it. Not because it had changed, it hadn't. That was the horror of it. The deeps were exactly as they had been when I left at 14. The same corridors, the same hammocks, the same flickering lumen cells casting the same weak light on the same gray walls. The same children running in packs through the same stretches of corridor I had run through as a boy. The same overseers on the same platforms with the same expressions of bored authority on their faces. Nothing had changed. 15 years, hundreds of engagements, thousands of dead crew replaced by thousands more, and the deeps had absorbed it all without a ripple, the way a deep ocean absorbs a stone. I found Deck 93. I found the stretch of corridor where my mother's hammock had been. The hammock was gone, replaced long ago by another, which had been replaced by another, and the hook on the wall had been bent and rebent by dozens of hands since Metha's. But the hook was the same hook. The wall was the same wall. The ceiling was the same underside of Deck 92's floor plating that my mother had stared at in the hours after my char-scraping shifts. I stood there and I looked up at it, and I understood something that should have been obvious but wasn't. The ceiling hadn't changed either. It was the same view she had seen. The same pipes, the same weld seams, the same pattern of stains from decades of condensation. She had stared at this exact surface, and I was staring at it now, and between those two moments lay her death and my entire life, and none of it was visible on the metal above me. A child came past, a char-scraper. I could tell by the gray-black staining on her hands and the flat blade tucked into her belt. She looked at me, at my master gunner's uniform, at the rank markings, at the clean skin and the straight posture and the well-fed weight on my frame. And her eyes went wide and then narrowed, the way a deep-born child's eyes narrow when they see something from the upper decks, something that belongs to the world that presses down on them. She didn't speak. She just passed, quick and quiet, back into the labyrinth she knew and I had almost forgotten. I left. I went back up through the ladderways, back to the gun deck, back to the cannon. I did not return to the deeps again. There was nothing there for me except the truth, and I already had more truth than I could carry. What I am going to tell you next requires some understanding of how time works on a warship that lives in the warp. The Valahest was always translating, always threading the needle between real space and the immaterium, and time in the warp does not behave. The ship's internal chronometers sometimes disagreed with the dates on supply manifests by weeks, even months. The crew didn't worry about it because worrying about warp time leads to madness. But I noticed. I had always noticed things that others let slide past them, and what I noticed in the years after Oseid's death was that the discrepancies were getting larger. Supply shipments started arriving late, not by days but by weeks. The astropathic messages, the psychic transmissions that were the Valahest's only link to the wider Imperium, became irregular, garbled, full of references to events and places that no one on the ship recognized. The navigator, a cloistered figure I had never seen but whose existence I inferred from the ship's ability to traverse the warp, was reported to be ill, then recovered, then ill again, then simply not mentioned at all, as if acknowledging her condition might make it real. The ship felt different. I struggle to describe this in a way that doesn't sound like superstition, because it isn't superstition. I had spent my entire life reading the Valahest's moods through its sounds and vibrations, and what I was reading now was something I had never felt before. The ship was anxious. The reactor thrum had developed a wobble, a faint irregularity that came and went like a fever. The grav plates on the lower decks, my old territory, the deeps, were fluctuating more than usual, producing localized pockets of heavy gravity that shifted without warning. The lights flickered, not the normal flicker of old systems and intermittent power, but a rhythmic pulse that seemed to follow a pattern I couldn't quite identify. The air tasted different. There was a metallic edge to it, a sharpness that the recyclers should have filtered out and didn't. Others noticed too, though most attributed it to age and wear. The Valahest was old and getting older. It had not been in a proper dock for refit in over 400 years, longer than anyone aboard had been alive, longer than anyone's grandparents had been alive. The tech priests performed their rituals and their maintenance, but there were limits to what prayer and sacred oil could accomplish on a machine that was slowly, inevitably wearing out. Systems that should have been replaced centuries ago were held together with patches and faith. Corridors that should have been habitable were sealed off because the structural integrity was too compromised to risk. The ship was shrinking, in a sense, its livable space contracting as its body aged, the way an old man's world contracts to the rooms he can still walk to. But I did not think it was just age. I thought the ship was trying to tell us something, in the only language it had, which was the language of its own body. Its sounds, its temperature, its vibrations. I thought the Valahest was warning us, and I thought we were too busy fighting to listen. The orders kept coming. New patrol routes, new targets, new enemies to engage in systems I had never heard of, which was not unusual in itself. The galaxy is vast and the Imperium's wars are endless. But the orders had a quality to them that troubled me. They were urgent, always urgent. Priority, alpha, immediate compliance, no deviation. There was no time for refit, no time for resupply, no time for anything except the next engagement and the next and the next. The crew was exhausted. The ship was exhausted. And still the orders came, transmitted through the astropathic choir, received by the communication officers, distributed to the department heads, and executed without question, because questioning an order in the Imperial Navy is the same as questioning the Emperor himself, and the Emperor does not tolerate questions. There was one engagement that I keep coming back to. Before I found the targeting data, before I understood what was happening, there was one moment that should have told me everything, and I missed it. We were engaging what the orders called a renegade transport convoy in a system designated Pelax 227. 3 cargo haulers, lightly armed, no escort. Easy prey. The kind of target the Valahayist could destroy in its sleep. The port battery opened fire, and the first 2 ships died quickly, expanding clouds of debris and atmosphere and whatever they had been carrying. But the 3rd ship did something unexpected. It turned, not to fight, not to flee. It turned broadside to us, and it stopped, dead in the void, presenting its full flank, and for 2 seconds before our next salvo hit, its signal lamps fired. Not weapon systems, signal lamps. The old kind, the optical blinkers that ships use for close-range communication when the Vox is down or compromised. The lamps were flashing in a pattern, and I was too far from the sensorium array to read it directly, but the cogitator logged it automatically, the way it logged everything, and I saw the notation scroll across my targeting screen. Incoming optical signal, standard Imperial fleet code, unable to decode before target destruction. Standard Imperial fleet code, not pirate signals, not renegade ciphers. Standard Imperial. The ship we were killing had been trying to talk to us in the language of the Imperial Navy. It had been trying to identify itself. I should have said something. I should have pulled the logs right then, cross-referenced the signal, raised the alarm. I didn't. The engagement was over. The convoy was debris. The order came to move on, immediately, no salvage survey, and we moved on. And I filed the notation away in the back of my mind, and I told myself it was a captured signal system, or an automated broadcast, or a malfunction, because the alternative was something I was not yet ready to look at. Not yet. But it stayed. A splinter in the mind that worked its way deeper with every day that passed. It was Mivra who first said it out loud. Mivra, who had survived the boarding at Vostrin's grief and lost her hand and gained a fog in her mind that never fully cleared, but who still, beneath that fog, had the sharpest instincts of anyone I had ever known. She had been carried on the Medici rolls for years, officially unfit for gun crew duty, but she refused to stay in the Medici ward. She drifted the gun deck like a ghost of the old crew, eating with us, sleeping near the emplacement she had once served. She came to my berth after a rest watch, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who is not sure she should be doing what she is doing, and she sat down and she said, "Breck, when was the last time we spoke to anyone who wasn't us?" I didn't understand at first. She clarified. When was the last time the Valahest had received a direct, verifiable communication from another Imperial vessel? When was the last time we had docked at a depot, resupplied from an Imperial station, made contact with any authority outside our own hull? Not the astropathic orders, she said. Those were just voices. When had we last seen another ship? I thought about it, and the answer crept over me like cold water. Months. It had been months. The Valahest had been operating alone for... I checked the ship's chronometer against my own reckoning, and the numbers didn't match, and neither of them felt right. For a long time. A very long time. The battle group we had been part of was gone. The escort ships were gone. We were alone in the void, following orders that came from a source we couldn't verify, engaging targets in systems we couldn't independently confirm, and the realization settled into my gut like ballast and stayed there. I began to ask questions, carefully, quietly, in the way that a man asks questions on a warship when he knows that the wrong question asked to the wrong person can end with a visit from the commissar. I talked to the other master gunners on the port battery. I talked to the bosuns and the senior ratings in the other departments. I found, to my growing unease, that I was not the only one who had noticed. The gunnery sergeant of the starboard battery, a woman named Dovra Chen, born on the ship, 40 years on the guns, with a face like a clenched fist, told me that her battery had expended more ammunition in the past 6 months than in the previous 2 years combined, and the resupply that should have arrived hadn't. The chief bosun of the lower decks told me that 3 sealed sections had been breached from the inside, not by crew, not by boarders, but by the ship itself, bulkheads buckling inward as if the metal was being pushed by something on the other side. The medic officer on Deck 40 reported that the number of crew presenting with nightmares, hallucinations, and what she carefully called perceptual irregularities had tripled in the past quarter. Something was wrong with the Valahest, something deeper than age, deeper than wear, deeper than the normal entropy of a 5,000-year-old machine. Something was wrong with us. The truth came to me the way most truths come on the Valahest. Not in a flash of revelation, but in a slow accumulation of evidence that I was too stubborn to ignore. Pelax 227 had been the first crack, weeks earlier. The signal lamps I had filed away and tried to forget. But the thing that finally broke it open was the debris. After our last 3 engagements, the gun crews had been ordered to stand down before the wreckage could be properly surveyed. Standard procedure after a void battle was to hold position and scan the debris field for survivors, salvage, and intelligence. Data cores, navigation logs, anything that could tell you more about the enemy you had just destroyed. The Valahest had always followed that procedure. It was doctrine. But for the past 3 battles, the order to move on had come immediately after the last enemy ship died. No scanning, no salvage, no time to look at what we had killed. I looked anyway. After the 3rd engagement, the one in the system the orders had designated as Viren 881, a meaningless alphanumeric code that didn't match any system I could find in the Valahest's navigational archive. I used my gunnery clearance to access the targeting cogitator's replay logs. The cogitator stored everything fire control had relayed down to the gun during an engagement. The auger returns the bridge fed us to build each firing solution, the shape, size, heading, and energy signature of every target we put a shell into. It was a maintenance tool used to calibrate the targeting systems and review accuracy after the fact. It was not classified. Any master gunner with a maintenance password could pull the logs. I pulled them. I sat in the targeting alcove beside emplacement 41, with the gun crew asleep in their hammocks and the gun deck quiet except for the endless breathing of the ship, and I activated the replay of our last engagement. The sensorium data unfolded on the screen in green-white lines and numbers and targeting reticles, and I watched the shapes of the enemy ships as the augurs had painted them for us. 3 vessels, cruiser class, all of them. Moving in formation, which was unusual for the kinds of enemies we had been fighting lately, and their energy signatures were wrong. I had spent 12 years reading targeting data. I knew what an orc ship's energy signature looked like: chaotic, spiking, inconsistent, because orc power systems were as undisciplined as the orcs themselves. I knew what chaos vessels read like: tainted, the energy patterns warped, and cycling in ways that made the cogitator's pattern-matching algorithms stutter. I knew what Eldar ships looked like, what Tau ships looked like, what the rare and terrifying signature of a Necron vessel looked like. The ships we had destroyed at Viren 881 read like none of those. Their energy signatures were clean, ordered, regular. Standard Imperial plasma reactor output, standard Imperial shield harmonics, standard Imperial drive emissions. I checked the data twice. I cross-referenced it against the Valahest's own signature profile, which was in the cogitator's memory as a baseline calibration reference. The match was close, not identical. Different ships have different specific outputs, but close enough that there was no ambiguity about what I was looking at. The 3 ships we had destroyed at Viren 881 were Imperial Navy vessels. Not chaos corrupted, not captured and recrewed. Imperial, flying Imperial colors, running Imperial systems, crewed by Imperial men and women who had probably died not understanding why a ship bearing the Emperor's own Aquila was firing on them. I pulled the logs for the previous 2 engagements. The same. Imperial signatures, both of them, 6 ships total, destroyed by the Valahest in 3 separate actions, and all 6 of them had been ours. I sat there, and the room contracted, and the air thickened, and I made myself keep reading, because stopping now would have been worse than knowing. The cogitator had more than just energy signatures. It had hull profiles, silhouettes. And for the 3rd engagement, Viren 881, it had captured a fragment of hull registry from one of the cruisers before the ship broke apart. A transponder ident, half corrupted by damage, but enough of it intact to read a name. The ship was the Cassafon's Resolve, a Dauntless-class light cruiser. I knew the name. Not from intelligence files I had no clearance to read, not from any officer's briefing. I knew it the way every gun crew on the port battery knew it, because for 8 months the Cassafon's Resolve had been the most talked-about ship in the fleet that none of us had ever seen. It was the vessel carrying our resupply, our ammunition, our shells. A gun crew obsesses over where its next rounds are coming from, the way a starving man obsesses over food. And we had counted the cycles waiting for that ship, cursed its delays, traded rumors about why it hadn't arrived. The ship we had been waiting for. The ship whose failure to come we had blamed on bureaucratic delays, or warp transit complications, or any of the 100 mundane reasons that supply shipments run late in the Imperium. We had killed our own supply ship. We had aimed our guns at the vessel carrying our ammunition and our food, and fired until there was nothing left. And then we had moved on, following orders from a voice that was not what it claimed to be, and we had wondered why no resupply came. The orders that came through the astropathic choir, urgent and unquestionable, directing us to these systems, to these targets. If the targets were Imperial ships, then the orders were wrong. Not misguided, not erroneous in the way that bureaucratic communications are sometimes erroneous. Deliberately wrong. Someone, something, was feeding the Valahest false orders, directing us to attack our own side, turning us into a weapon aimed at the Imperium we had served for 5,000 years. And here is the part that I could not stop turning over. The part that made it possible, the part that is the truest and ugliest thing I know about how a warship kills. A gun crew never sees what it destroys. We are buried in the iron heart of the ship, decks below the bridge, in a cathedral of metal with no window to the void, and no view of anything but the breach in front of us. We do not aim. The bridge aims. Fire control feeds a firing solution down to the cannon, bearing, elevation, range. And we put the shell where the numbers say, and somewhere out in the black a ship we have never laid eyes on comes apart, and we never know what it was. We had been killing Imperial vessels for months, and not one of us on the guns had seen a single Aquila, because we had never seen anything at all. We killed designations, contacts, numbers handed down from a command that had got them from a choir that was dead. And the men who could see, the auger crews, the officers on the bridge, they fired on contacts that command had designated hostile. And in the Imperial Navy, you do not question a target designation any more than you question the color of the Emperor's eyes. The thing in the warp had not needed to corrupt 80,000 minds. It had only needed to corrupt the one voice that told all 80,000 of us where to point the guns. And there was a harder question still, the one that kept me awake through the rest watches. If the orders were false, someone above me should have known. The astropathic choir did not operate in isolation. A choir master oversaw them. Communications officers logged every transmission they sent and received. Tech priests tended the equipment, blessed the bindings, walked that chamber on their maintenance rounds. For the choir to be compromised, every one of them would have had to miss it, and a thing like that is not missed. So I did what a careful man does. I asked, quietly through the few channels a master gunner could reach. I sent word up to the communications section asking why no resupply had come, why our orders no longer carried a verification cipher I recognized, and the answers came back smooth and certain and wrong. The choir was functioning normally, they said. The choir master had inspected it that very cycle and found the psychers at their work, the transmissions clean, the Emperor's light upon them. Everyone who went to that chamber came back saying the same words in the same untroubled voice. The choir is well. The choir is well, and that was when I understood that I would have to see it myself. Not because my eyes were better than theirs, but because I am deep-born, and the deep-born do not navigate by what we are told. We navigate by what the metal tells us. And for months the metal had been telling me that something in this ship was dead. I went to the astropathic chamber. Not alone. I brought Dovra Chen and 3 of her most trusted armsmen, because walking into the spire section of an Imperial warship without armed escort, when you suspect something has gone wrong with the ship's psychic communications, is the kind of thing that gets you killed in ways that don't have clean explanations. I chose Dovra for more than her nerve. Her father had served his last years on the spire detail, and she had walked those upper corridors as a girl while I was still learning to read the deeps. The path to the chamber lived in her bones when it was a blank to me. The chamber was high up, near the command levels, in a sealed section that ordinary crew did not enter. There were guards at the door, ship's armsmen, and they were wrong. I saw it the moment we approached. They stood at their posts, upright, weapons shouldered, but their eyes were glassy and half-focused, like the eyes of men dreaming with the lids open. The same metallic taste hung in the air around them, thick as fog. Whatever lived in that chamber had reached out through the sealed door and dulled the very men set to watch it, fed them the same comfortable nothing it had been feeding the whole command spire. Dovra spoke to them. They answered slowly from somewhere very far away, and they stood aside and let us pass without ever truly seeing that we were there. We went in. The astropathic choir of the Valahest consisted of 8 psychers, sanctioned by the Imperium, trained to send and receive psychic messages across the vast distances of space. They lived in the chamber permanently, connected to the ship's communication systems through a web of cables and neural interfaces and ritual bindings that the tech priests maintained and the rest of the crew tried not to think about. The chamber was supposed to be warm, lit, humming with the focused psychic energy of 8 trained minds working in concert to keep the ship connected to the Imperium. It was cold. The temperature hit me first, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the environmental systems and everything to do with something else, something I could feel in my gut and in the back of my skull, a wrongness, a pressure. The lights were on, but they were dim, flickering in that rhythmic pattern I had noticed in the lower decks, and the air had that metallic taste, stronger here, sharp enough to make my eyes water. And I understood, standing in that doorway, why every man who had walked this room came away calling it well. The thing in here could fill a mind with whatever that mind arrived expecting. A choir master on his rounds saw 8 psychers at prayer, because that is what a choir master expects to find. But the lie needed a willing host. It needed a mind reaching for the comfortable picture, and we had not come for comfort. We had come hunting the rot, certain it was here, refusing the easy answer before we ever crossed the threshold. And a lie has nothing to grip in people who have already decided not to believe it. It could not warm the freezing room. It could not put the moisture back in a corpse, so it showed us nothing, and we saw what was actually there. The chamber was arranged in a circle, the 8 choir thrones positioned around a central amplification array, and the psychers were in their thrones, and they were not alive. They had been dead for a long time. The bodies were desiccated, sunken into the neural interface cradles that held them in place, their skin drawn tight over their bones, their eyes open and hollow and staring at something that was not in the room. The cables and interface ports were still connected. The ritual bindings were still in place, but the bindings had changed. The sanctified parchment strips that should have borne prayers and hexagrammic wards were darkened, the text obscured by a fine black residue that looked disturbingly like the carbon I had spent my childhood scraping from the ship's ducts. And in places, the parchment had been replaced, or grown over, by something else. A thin, translucent membrane stretched between the cables, organic-looking, faintly pulsing, as if it had its own heartbeat. It connected the dead psychers to the amplification array in a web that had not been designed by any tech priest. One of the armsmen Dovra had brought stepped forward and touched the membrane with the barrel of his last gun. It recoiled from the contact. It moved, like something alive that had been disturbed in its sleep. Everything was functioning as if the choir was still active, still receiving and transmitting, still doing the job they had been placed here to do. But the psychers were husks, empty, dead for months, maybe longer. And as I stood there, looking at the circle of dead men and women in their thrones, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The nearest psycher, a woman, or what had been a woman, had her mouth open. Her jaw was slack the way a dead person's jaw goes slack, but her lips were moving. Tiny, infinitesimal movements, the kind you might miss if you weren't looking directly at them. Shaping words, forming syllables in a language I didn't know, over and over, a silent recitation that her dead brain could not possibly be producing, and the equipment was still receiving. I could hear it, not with my ears, with something else, something deeper. A whispering at the edge of my perception, a sound like voices speaking in a language I almost recognized, and the sound was coming from the amplification array at the center of the chamber, from the psychic resonance coils that were supposed to channel the choir's transmissions. The coils were active. They were glowing, faintly, with a light that was not the warm gold of sanctioned psychic energy, but something colder, something that shifted between colors that had no names I knew. The array was receiving transmissions, but the choir was dead, which meant the transmissions were not coming from the Imperium. They were coming from the warp. Something in the Immaterium had found the Valahest's open channel, the dead choir, the active equipment, the unguarded psychic conduit, and it had been using it, feeding us orders, directing us, turning our guns on our own people and watching us pull the trigger again and again, because we were soldiers and soldiers follow orders, and we had never once thought to ask whether the voice giving the orders was the one we thought it was. I stood in that chamber and I understood. The flickering lights, the metallic air, the gravity shifts, the nightmares. The sealed sections breached from inside. The ship hadn't been warning us. The ship had been infected. Something had gotten in through the dead choir, and it was spreading through the Valahest's systems, the way a disease spreads through a body. And we had been too busy following our orders to notice that our orders were the disease. Dovra said what I was thinking. She said it in 3 words, and the words were, "We are traitors." For a moment, her armsmen brought their weapons up, and I felt the same thought move through all of us at once. Destroy it. Here, now, cut the cables and burn the membrane and silence the thing that had been using our hands. But the thing was awake. It had felt the last gun touch it, and the coils at the center of the chamber were glowing brighter now, and the cold was deepening by the second, and whatever lived on the other side of that membrane was not something 5 souls with las guns and blades were going to unmake. This was the work of a demon. I had no other word for it, and a demon is not killed by a gun crew with las guns and cutlasses. There were old stories, the kind that pass between watches in the dark, that no chaplain ever confirmed and no commissar ever let you finish telling, of gray-armored men who came for things like this, sent by powers a rating was never meant to name. Maybe the stories were true. It made no difference. No such men were aboard the Valahest, and there was no time left to pray for them. And even if we had torn the array apart with our bare hands, it would have changed nothing, because the conduit was sunk into the ship's spine, grown through the cogitator cores and the power feeds, layered over with 5,000 years of tech priest ritual. We could no more cut it out than I could cut my own heart from my chest and keep walking. So we did the only thing left to us. We backed out of that chamber, and we sealed the door, and we left the dead choir to its whispering, not by choice, not by intent, not through any failure of loyalty or faith, but in the eyes of the Imperium, in the calculus of the Imperial Navy, in the judgment of whatever authority we had been destroying convoys for, the distinction between a ship that turned traitor and a ship that was made traitor would matter exactly as much as the distinction between a bullet fired in anger and a bullet fired by accident. The result was the same. The dead were the same. The Valahest had been killing Imperial servants for months, and nothing, no explanation, no evidence, no plea, would save us from the consequences. Dovra wanted to go to the bridge anyway, force the truth into the open, make the Lord Captain see what was riding in his ship, make him break off and silence the guns before the Valahest killed one more vessel flying the Emperor's colors. I told her it would not matter. Even if the Lord Captain believed us, even if he acted immediately, the damage was done. The ships we had destroyed were gone. Their crews were dead. Somewhere in the Imperium, someone had already noticed that Imperial vessels were being lost in the sectors where the Valahest operated, and someone had already drawn the obvious conclusion. I was right. It took less than a day. They came out of the warp like a fist through a wall. 6 ships, real ones this time, with energy signatures that blazed across the sensorium like sunlight. 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, all bearing the markings of Battlefleet Thesaphon, the same fleet authority the Valahest had nominally served under for as far back as my service went. They did not hail us. They did not demand our surrender. They did not attempt communication of any kind. They came in with their guns hot and their torpedo tubes loaded and their void shields running at full power, and the first salvo hit the Valahest before the bridge had even finished sounding general quarters. The ship screamed, the same sound I had heard when I was born, the deep, resonant wail of the hull under fire, the voice of the Valahest in pain. It was a sound I had lived with my entire life, but it had never sounded like this before. There was a finality to it, a terminal note like a chord resolving to its last, lowest tone. The ship knew. I believe that. I will always believe that. The Valahest knew what was happening, and it was not surprised, and it was not afraid. It was tired. It was old and tired and sick, and it had been used by something it couldn't fight, and now its own kin were here to put it down, and the ship accepted this the way it accepted everything, with the vast, patient endurance of a machine that has survived 5,000 years and knows that all things, even itself, come to an end. I was on the gun deck when the first salvo hit. The impact threw me sideways into the cannon housing, and for a moment I was 14 again. Ribs cracking against metal, the air full of smoke and noise, and Ossid was beside me telling me to hold steady. But Ossid was dead, and the smoke was real, and the crew was scrambling to their stations, and the cannon was waiting to fire, and I was the master gunner, and the targeting data was coming through, and the targets were Imperial, and I had a choice to make. The gun crew was looking at me. 18 people. Some I had trained from the conscription pool, the way Ossid had trained me. Some had been with me for years, through a dozen engagements, through the boarding actions and the convoy runs, and the long, empty watches between. They were at their stations, hands on loading chains and traverse wheels and sponge mops, and they were waiting for me to say fire, because that is what I always said, because that is what a master gunner says when the cannon is loaded and the target is on the reticle and the ship is screaming for blood. The cannon was aimed. The shell was seated. The breech was closed. One word from me and the gun would speak, and Imperial sailors would die, and the voice from the warp that had been feeding us targets would get another mark on whatever tally it was keeping. I thought about the corridor, the 11 porters behind the blast doors, the arithmetic of sacrifice. I thought about Ossid on the wrong side of the bulkhead, shaping words through the frost. I thought about my mother, 60 meters from the seal, still running. Every choice I had ever witnessed on this ship had been the same choice. Who dies so that others don't? And every time the answer had been the one that was logical and defensible and utterly without mercy. Every time someone had pulled the lever or signed the order or given the word and the machine had ground forward over the bodies of the acceptable dead. I did not fire. I gave the order to stand down. My crew looked at me as if I had gone mad, and I told them what I had found in the astropathic chamber. I told them about the dead choir and the warp transmissions and the Imperial signatures on the ships we had been killing. I told them we were traitors. Not by choice, but traitors nonetheless. And I told them I would not add to the tally. I would not fire on more Imperial ships. Not one more round. The Emperor's enemies had used our hands to do their killing, and the least we could do, the only thing we had left, was to stop letting them. For the first time in my life, the arithmetic gave a different answer. Not because the numbers changed, because I did. On any other day, refusing to fire would have ended with a bolt round through my skull. That is what the Navy keeps political officers for. But Commissar Galt, who had walked the port gun decks for as long as I had served on them, was already dead. The Imperial fire was gutting the Valahest from the spine outward, and the fire control galleries are among the first things any naval gunner aims for. The command tier of the port battery went in that storm of lance strikes, along with 100 other vital things. Galt, the battery officer, half the deck wardens, all of them buried under collapsed plating I would never have the time or the reason to dig through. There was no one left to shoot me. The chain that held the gun decks in line had been cut at the top by the same fire I was now refusing to answer. And into that gap, for the length of a few impossible minutes, stepped the only authority left standing on the port battery, which was me. Not every gun crew followed my lead. Some did, some didn't. The starboard battery fired a full broadside before Dovra Chen could get the word to her people, and 2 of the destroyers took hits. But the port battery went silent, gun by gun, emplacement by emplacement, as the word spread from my crew to the next and the next. It wasn't enough. The starboard battery alone couldn't fight off 6 Imperial warships, and the Valahest was already wounded, already old, already dying in the slow way it had been dying for centuries. The incoming fire tore into us. Lance strikes burned through the hull armor and opened the ship to the void, deck by deck. The same way the venting had opened the deeps when I was 11, except this time there was no plan and no purpose, just destruction. Just the Imperium reclaiming its property with fire and force the way it always does. I stayed at my station. The gun deck was breaking apart around me. The ceiling was buckling, the deck plate splitting, the air thinning as breaches opened in the hull and the void reached in. My crew was dying. I could hear them, or not hear them. The sound was going, everything was going. The noise was being replaced by a silence that was deeper than any silence I had ever known, even in the quietest duct, even in the stillest corner of the deeps. The ship's thrum was fading, the constant companion of my entire life, the heartbeat I had been born to, the rhythm that had shaped everything I was. It was slowing, getting quieter, getting fainter. The Valahest was dying. Not being killed, dying. There is a difference. A ship that is killed resists to the end, its reactors overloading, its weapons firing, its crew fighting and screaming and raging against the dark. The Valahest was not doing any of those things. It was settling. The way an old creature settles when it has been walking for too long and its legs give out and it just goes down slowly, gently, with a sound that is more like a sigh than a collapse. I felt the deck tilt as the ship lost attitude control. I felt the gravity shift as the grav plates began to fail, one section at a time, bottom to top, deeps to bridge. I felt the heat drain out of the air as the reactor output dropped below sustainable levels, and the cold of the void began to creep in through the breaches, and the ship let it come. I was on the deck. I don't remember falling. My back was against the cannon housing. My cannon, the Mars pattern with the pull to port and the stick at 43 degrees. And I could feel the metal against my spine, cold now, the warmth of the machinery fading as the power died. My char-scraping blade was still in my belt, where it had been since I was 7 years old. I put my hand on it. The handle was worn smooth from decades of carrying, the edge long since dulled. But it was mine, the first thing that was ever mine, the last thing that would be. The ship's humming was almost gone, just a whisper. Just the faintest vibration, like the last pulse of a heart that knows it is beating for the final time. Then, and I will tell you this because it happened, because I felt it, and whether you believe me is your business and not mine, the vibration changed. Just for a moment. The Valahest's dying thrum shifted, the way it used to shift when the ship was adjusting course, when the reactor thrum would drop half a tone and the grav plates would sing a different note. But there was no course change. There was nowhere to go. The shift was something else. A pattern I knew but couldn't place. Something from the deep decks, from the ducts, from the years when I navigated by sound and vibration because I had no other chart. The ship was speaking. Not words, not a message I could decode. Just a feeling that passed through the metal into my spine and settled in my chest, and it felt like the half-second of weightlessness I had known as a child in the deeps, when the grav plates stuttered and you could float for a heartbeat before the ship pulled you back down. That was it. That was the Valahest's last word. A heartbeat of weightlessness, a letting go. And in that silence, in the cold, in the dark that was falling across the gun deck like a curtain coming down, I heard it. My mother's sound. That small, defeated noise she used to make in her throat when she looked at my hands after a shift in the ducts. The vibration that was not quite a sigh and not quite a word. I heard it in the metal. I heard it in the last breath of the Valahest's dying systems. I heard it in my own chest, where my heart was still beating even though the ship's was not, one last stubborn rhythm refusing to stop, because no one had ever taught it how. I was born on this ship, in the dark, in the filth, in the belly of a machine that was older than nations and more indifferent than God. I lived on this ship. I worked and fought and lost and loved in the ways that the ship allowed, which were never gentle and never enough, and always, always in service to something larger than myself. I was made by this ship. Every part of me, from the carbon stains on my hands, to the cannon fire deafness in my left ear, to the weight I carried behind my ribs, where other men keep their softness. All of it was the ship's work. The Valahest made me, and now the Valahest was unmaking me, taking me back the way it took everyone back, into the silence, into the cold, into the metal. My name is Breck. I was born on the Valahest, and this is where I die. Not a hero, not a villain, just a man who lived his whole life inside a weapon, and who learned too late that the weapon had been aimed at the wrong target. The ship is dark now. The air is thin. The gun is cold under my back, and my hands are in my lap, and they are still stained gray-black from the carbon, still marked by the deeps, still shaped like the tools I have held and the work I have done, and the life I have lived inside this hull. The Valahest is quiet for the first time since I was born. I think I understand now what my mother was looking at when she stared at the ceiling. Not the weight above her, the silence beyond it, the vast, patient silence of the void, waiting on the other side of the metal, waiting for the ship to open up and let it in. She heard it. She always heard it. I hear it now,